Hello tonight's history crew. Tonight we're diving into something that might seem small, but has haunted people for literally thousands of years, being left-handed. That's right. Something as simple as which hand you naturally reach for has been enough to get you accused of witchcraft, beaten at school, or even considered morally corrupt. About 10% of us are lefties. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've got a lefty in your life. But did you know that for most of human history that simple trait would have made your life a living nightmare? Forget discrimination based on the big stuff. Humans have managed to create entire systems of fear and punishment around which hand you write with. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But also fascinatingly dark. So before we plunge into this journey through centuries of superstition and straight-up cruelty, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know if you're a lefty or know someone who is. Let's start with something seemingly innocent. Language. But here's the thing. Language tells us everything about how people think, and when it comes to left-handedness, languages around the world have been throwing shade for millennia. In English, the word right doesn't just mean a direction, it means correct, proper, just. Meanwhile, left comes from the Old English lift, meaning weak or broken. Coincidence? Not exactly. In Latin, the word for right is dexter, which gives us words like dexterous and dexterity, meaning skillful. And left? That's sinister. Yes, seriously. The word we use for something evil, threatening or malevolent literally just meant left-handed originally. Talk about linguistic discrimination baked right into our vocabulary. French isn't any kinder. Their word for left is gauche, which also means awkward or socially clumsy. And in Italian, the word mancino for lefty also has connotations of dishonesty or trickery. This isn't just a Western thing either. In Mandarin Chinese, the character for left can carry negative associations in certain contexts, and in many cultures around the world, there's a deep-seated belief that the left hand is unclean or impure. Words matter, and for thousands of years, the very words we use for left have been quietly whispering wrong, bad, evil into our collective consciousness. Is it any wonder that left-handed people were treated with suspicion when our very language told us they were sinister by default? So when did this whole left-hand bad thing start? Pretty much as soon as humans started building civilizations. In ancient Egypt, hieroglyphics often showed the left side associated with death and demons. Though fascinatingly, they were a bit less judgy than later cultures. Some evidence suggests they recognized the unique abilities of left-handed people, particularly in certain crafts and battle. The ancient Greeks took things up a notch. They were obsessed with duality, light, dark, male, female, and yep, right-left. Aristotle himself, supposedly one of history's great thinkers, wrote that women were essentially incomplete or deformed men, and similarly left was an incomplete or deformed version of right. Thanks for that stellar analysis, Aristotle. Romans were watching birds for omens, and birds appearing on the left side were bad omens. The Latin word sinister originally just meant on the left side, but because of these superstitions it eventually took on all those dark meanings we associate with it today. But perhaps most influential were the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, where the right hand was specifically associated with taking oaths and making promises. Your right hand was your word, your bond, your honour. The left? That was for, well, basically toilet functions. Not exactly setting lefties up for social success. What's remarkable is how widespread these associations were. From China to the Middle East to Europe, ancient civilizations independently developed suspicions about left-handedness. It seems humans have always had this weird tendency to assign moral values to completely neutral physical traits. Now, if you really want to cement a prejudice into society, get religion involved. And boy, did religions have opinions about handedness. The Bible mentions the right hand over 100 times, almost always positively. In the book of Matthew, we hear about the righteous being placed at God's right hand, while the damned are sent to the left. The right hand gives blessings. It's the hand of honour and power. Psalm 118 declares, "The right hand of the Lord does valiantly." Not a lot of biblical shout-outs for God's left hand doing anything particularly impressive. In fact, in Ecclesiastes, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Subtle. In Christian art, Jesus sits at the right hand of God. Saints and the saved are portrayed on the right side of paintings, while sinners and demons lurk on the left. Even in the Last Judgment scenes, the saved go to heaven on the right, while the damned are dragged to hell on the left. Islam has similar traditions where the right hand is for clean, honourable actions like eating or greeting people, while the left is reserved for, well, toilet hygiene. In many Islamic cultures, it's still considered deeply offensive to eat, shake hands, or give gifts with your left hand. Even Buddhism and Hinduism, often seen as more tolerant traditions, have some traditional preferences for the right hand in certain rituals and practices. When the most powerful social institutions in history are telling you that God himself prefers righties, it's not surprising that left-handed people were viewed with religious suspicion. After all, if God wanted you to use your right hand, why were you naturally reaching with your left? The Middle Ages, when superstition wasn't just a quirky belief but the organising principle of entire societies. And if you were left-handed during this time, yikes. In medieval Europe, left-handedness wasn't just unusual. It was considered a mark of the devil. The reasoning went something like this. God is good, God is on the right, therefore the devil must be on the left. Simple, tidy and absolutely devastating if you happen to be born preferring your left hand. Villages had local wisdom about spotting witches and servants of Satan, and guess what was high on the list? Yep, using your left hand. Along with other suspicious traits like birthmarks, unusual birthdays, or being an older woman who lived alone with a cat. The bar for demonic suspicion was pretty low. Medieval art really drives this home. Look at any painting of hell or demons from this period, and count how many are using their left hands for their evil deeds. It's not subtle. What's fascinating is how practical concerns got mixed up with supernatural ones. Left-handed people genuinely struggled with tools and daily life in medieval society because everything was designed for righties. Their awkwardness using right-handed tools only reinforced the belief that there was something off about them. It was a vicious cycle. Society made life difficult for lefties, then pointed to their difficulties as proof they were cursed or corrupted. And in an era where unexplained events, from storms to crop failures to illnesses, were quickly attributed to witchcraft and demonic influence, being visibly different in any way was dangerous. Left-handedness was one of the most visible differences in everyday life, making lefties convenient scapegoats when communities needed someone to blame. Let's get specific about why the left hand itself was considered so darn evil, shall we? In medieval demonology, yes, that was actually a field of study, the devil was believed to baptize his followers using his left hand. When people were accused of witchcraft, investigators would look for the devil's mark, which was supposedly left by the devil's left hand on the witch's body. There was this widespread belief that the devil was left-handed, and that he would appear on the left shoulder of people to tempt them into sin. Your guardian angel, meanwhile, helpfully hung out on your right shoulder trying to steer you toward virtue. The imagery was so common it's still used in cartoons today. That little angel and devil on your shoulders. That's straight-up medieval superstition about left and right. Left-handed people were believed to have special powers, and not the fun, superhero kind. It was thought they could cast the evil eye with just a glance, causing illness, bad luck, or even death. In parts of Europe, meeting a left-handed person first thing in the morning was considered an omen so bad that some people would turn around and go back home, rather than risk continuing their day. There were even elaborate folk remedies for curing left-handedness, from specialised prayers to rituals involving herbs and special waters. Some people wore amulets specifically to protect themselves from the supposed dark magic of lefties. The sign of the cross, right to left in Western Christianity, was another way the right is blessed, left is cursed idea was reinforced daily. And since most people couldn't read the Bible themselves, these physical rituals and folk beliefs shaped their understanding of spirituality more than the actual texts. What's truly bizarre is how universal these superstitions were. From Northern Europe to Mediterranean countries, similar fears about the left hand popped up independently. It's like humans were determined to fear left-handedness no matter where they lived. Now, if there's one thing history loves more than demonizing left-handed people, it's finding extra ways to demonize women. And when these two prejudices collided, double trouble. Left-handed women faced an especially harsh judgment throughout history. In the witch trials that swept through Europe and later colonial America, being left-handed was considered evidence of witchcraft, and about 80% of those accused of witchcraft were women. Do the math, and left-handed women were in serious danger. Why? Well, women were already considered more susceptible to the devil's influence according to medieval theology. Eve took the apple after all. Add in left-handedness, already associated with the devil, and you've got yourself a perfect witch candidate in the eyes of superstitious communities. There are accounts from witch trials where a woman's left-handedness was specifically noted as evidence against her. In a time when proof could include such rigorous scientific tests as she has a mole or her cat looks suspicious, being left-handed was practically a confession of satanic dealings. Even outside of witch trials, left-handed women faced unique challenges. While a left-handed man might be feared, he could also be valued in certain contexts like warfare. Left-handed women had no such silver lining. They were just seen as doubly corrupted, both by their gender and their handedness. Fascinatingly, some scholars believe this is why we see slightly more left-handed men than women even today. The theory goes that the social pressure to switch handedness was stronger on girls than boys throughout history, essentially forcing more naturally left-handed girls to become right-handed than boys. Historical trauma literally reshaping our demographics. It's yet another example of how multiple prejudices can stack and intensify, creating even more dangerous conditions for those who fall into more than one feared or marginalised category. So what happened if you were born left-handed in these superstitious times? Did everyone just point and scream witch while backing away? Sometimes. But more often, society took a more hands-on approach, forced conversion. Forcing left-handed people to use their right hands has been a global practice for centuries. Parents, teachers, priests, and doctors all got involved in this crusade against the left hand. And their methods? Let's just say they weren't gentle. The most common technique was simply tying down the left hand or binding it to the body so it couldn't be used. Imagine trying to learn to write, eat, or do basically anything with your non-dominant hand while your natural hand is physically restrained. For hours, day after day, for children as young as 3 or 4. Some cultures took it even further. There are accounts of children having their left arms tied behind their backs for entire days. Some had their left hands immersed in hot water to train them out of using it. Others were beaten when caught using their left hands, a practice that continued in many schools well into the 20th century. In parts of China, Japan and Korea, left-handed children would have their left hands soaked in vinegar or boiling water as punishment for using them. Brutal ink and water beatings were common in Chinese schools for students caught writing with their left hands. The psychological impact was enormous. Children were taught that their natural instincts were wrong, sinful, and needed to be corrected through pain and restraint. Many developed stutter, anxiety, and other stress-related conditions from this forcible rewiring of their brains. What's truly heartbreaking is that many parents genuinely believed they were helping their children by putting them through this. They feared the social and spiritual consequences their kids would face as lefties, and believed the short-term suffering of conversion was worth avoiding a lifetime of prejudice and suspicion. Let's talk about school, where left-handed kids throughout history received daily lessons in shame, pain, and disappointment along with their ABCs. Until shockingly recently, schools worldwide were battlegrounds in the war against left-handedness. Teachers were often the frontline enforcers tasked with beating the devil out of left-handed children, sometimes literally. In Victorian-era schools, using your left hand for writing could get you caned across the knuckles. Some teachers would walk the aisles with rulers, ready to smack any left hand that dared pick up a pen. Others would tie children's left hands to their chairs or desks. In some particularly strict schools, left-handed students had to wear a green ribbon or armband, marking them for extra scrutiny and correction. The design of school desks was another form of institutional discrimination. Right-arm desks were standard, leaving left-handed students contorted into uncomfortable positions just to complete their assignments. Imagine trying to learn while physically unable to sit properly at your desk for hours every day. Writing itself was a special nightmare. Fountain pens and inkwells, standard until surprisingly recently, were particularly cruel to lefties. The way left-handed people have to position their hands when writing often meant dragging their hand through wet ink, resulting in smudged work and ink-stained hands. Teachers would then punish them for messy papers, ignoring the fact that the entire writing system was designed against them. Even the direction of writing in Western languages, left to right, is a disadvantage for lefties, who naturally pull the pen rather than push it across the page as right-handed people do. And if you were left-handed in a culture that wrote right to left like Arabic or Hebrew, still out of luck as the religious associations with the right hand remained. The educational torture extended beyond writing. Scissors, rulers, pencil sharpeners. Everyday school tools were designed for right-handed use. Using them with your left hand meant awkward grips, poor results, and often more punishment for careless work. Is it any wonder that historically left-handed students showed higher rates of reading difficulties, stuttering, and school-related anxiety? The miracle isn't that they struggled, it's that any of them succeeded at all under such conditions. While the fear of left-handedness has been surprisingly universal, not all cultures express this prejudice in exactly the same way. Let's take a global tour of left-hand discrimination, shall we? In Western cultures, as we've seen, the fear was deeply tied to Christian demonology and superstition. The left was sinister, devilish, morally corrupt. But move eastward, and the taboos take on different flavours. In many parts of the Middle East, South Asia and North Africa, the left-hand taboo centred more around purity and cleanliness than supernatural evil. In these regions, the left hand was traditionally used for toilet hygiene in the days before toilet paper. So using your left hand for eating, greeting or handling sacred objects wasn't just rude, it was disgusting. In India, even today, the left hand is considered impure. Food is eaten with the right hand only. Sacred texts and objects are handled exclusively with the right. It's not about the devil here. It's about ritual purity and pollution. Japan had its own approach. Until the mid-20th century, left-handedness was strongly discouraged through social pressure, rather than physical punishment in many cases. Left-handed children weren't necessarily beaten, but they were relentlessly corrected, and could face significant social ostracism for failing to conform. Some African cultures had particularly complex views. In certain West African traditions, twins were believed to be spiritual mirrors of each other, meaning one should naturally be left-handed. In these contexts, forcing both to be right-handed was seen as disrupting a cosmic balance. A rare example of left-handedness being accepted, but only in very specific circumstances. Indigenous Australian cultures stand out as having been generally more accepting of left-handedness, with some evidence suggesting left-handed members held special roles in certain ceremonies and activities. What's fascinating is that despite these cultural variations, the practical result was similar worldwide. Left-handed people were pressured to conform to right-handed norms, whether through religious fear, concerns about purity, or social expectations of proper behaviour. And everywhere, the language of right versus wrong embedded these prejudices into daily speech, ensuring that even as religious fears faded, the stigma lingered in our very vocabulary. So why are some people left-handed in the first place? And how did science try to explain, or more often pathologise, this natural variation? Let's start with the actual biology. Left-handedness is largely determined by genetics and brain development. It's related to which hemisphere of your brain is dominant for certain functions. Most left-handed people have right brain dominance for hand control, while most right-handed people have left brain dominance. It's a natural variation in human development, occurring in about 10% of the population, across virtually all human cultures and throughout recorded history. But historical science had other ideas. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as scientific approaches began replacing purely religious explanations, left-handedness was still viewed as pathological. Just instead of possessed by the devil, it was now brain-damaged. The scientific theories were wild. Some doctors believed left-handedness indicated a developmental defect or neurological damage. Others claimed it showed a weakness in the nervous system. There were theories that left-handed people had shorter lifespans, were more prone to criminal behaviour, or were intellectually inferior. Cesare Lombroso, an influential 19th century criminologist, literally included left-handedness in his list of physical traits that indicated criminal tendencies. Phrenologists, Those pseudoscientists who claim to read character from the bumps on your skull often considered left-handedness evidence of primitive development or moral deficiency. Even Sigmund Freud got in on the action, suggesting that left-handedness might indicate an unresolved relationship with the mother. Because of course he did. The medical establishment used these theories to justify continued discrimination, while the forced conversion practices got rebranded as therapy rather than punishment. Same torture, fancier terminology. What's truly frustrating is that actual scientific research on brain development and handedness was available by the early 20th century, showing left-handedness was simply a natural variation. But prejudice runs deep, and it took decades for this research to overcome centuries of superstition, dressed up in scientific language. Today we know left-handedness is just one of many natural variations in human neurology, like eye colour or height. But the damage done by centuries of pseudo-scientific pathologizing continues to echo in subtle biases that persist even now. The history of left-handed persecution isn't just about anonymous masses. Many well-known historical figures suffered through forced conversion and discrimination for their left-handedness. King George VI of England, yes, the king from the King's Speech, was naturally left-handed but forced to write with his right hand. This forced switch is believed to have contributed to his severe stutter, which tormented him throughout his life and complicated his role as monarch during World War II. Imagine how different his reign might have been if he'd simply been allowed to use his natural hand. Lewis Carroll, author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, was another famous lefty forced to convert. Some literary scholars believe the themes of reversal and opposite worlds in his writing were influenced by his experience of being forced to use his non-dominant hand, essentially being made to function in a backward world. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were both left-handed, and both faced prejudice for it. Leonardo famously wrote in mirror script from right to left, possibly an adaptation to avoid smudging ink as he wrote with his left hand, or perhaps a creative response to the stigma associated with his natural-handedness. In more recent times, the musician Paul McCartney has spoken about being forced to write right-handed at school, though he continued to play guitar left-handed. Oprah Winfrey has also discussed being hit on the hand for using her left hand as a child. Even the 40th US President Ronald Reagan was born left-handed, but trained to use his right hand. Like many converts, he became somewhat ambidextrous, using his right hand for writing but his left for many other tasks. These stories from familiar figures humanize the abstract history we've been discussing. Behind the statistics and cultural practices were real people, some of them brilliant artists, leaders and thinkers, who were made to feel broken or wrong for a simple biological trait. Their stories make us wonder how many other potential geniuses throughout history had their confidence crushed, or their natural abilities stifled by this senseless prejudice. And for every famous person whose struggles were documented, countless ordinary people endured the same treatment without recognition, or the privilege of leaving historical records of their experiences. Believe it or not, being left-handed wasn't just socially stigmatized. In some times and places it was literally against the law. Let's look at how legal systems formalized anti-lefty discrimination. In medieval Europe, judicial systems often incorporated handedness into legal proceedings. Trial by combat sometimes required the accused to fight with their right hand, regardless of their natural dominance. Lefties facing such trials were at an obvious disadvantage, forced to fight with their weaker hand against right-handed opponents using their stronger one. Some legal codes explicitly mentioned left-handedness as a mark against a person's character, or credibility as a witness. In parts of Spain and Italy during the Inquisition, being left-handed could be recorded as evidence supporting accusations of heresy or witchcraft. Not conclusive on its own, but definitely not helping your case. Marriage laws in certain regions even listed left-handedness as a potential ground for annulment, like it was some kind of defect that had been concealed from a spouse. Imagine discovering your new husband writes with his left hand and running to the courts to have the whole marriage invalidated. Wild. In Japan during the Meiji era, left-handedness was officially discouraged through educational policies that mandated right-handed writing. This wasn't just cultural preference, it was codified in educational law. Even in the United States as recently as the early 20th century, Some states had educational statutes requiring teachers to force students to write with their right hands. These weren't suggestions, they were legal requirements enforced by school inspectors. Military regulations worldwide often implicitly discriminated against left-handed people through equipment design and training protocols that assumed right-handedness. In some armies, left-handed shooting was explicitly forbidden regardless of the soldier's natural aim and accuracy. The legal bias extended to professional licensing in certain fields. Some trades and professions, particularly those requiring precision handwork, would not accept left-handed apprentices or practitioners, effectively barring lefties from entire career paths. While most explicit legal discrimination against left-handed people has disappeared today, its legacy lives on in systems and institutions designed with right-handed people in mind, creating de facto, if not de jure, disadvantages for the left-handed minority. Beyond the dramatic persecution and legal discrimination, left-handed people throughout history faced countless daily frustrations and practical challenges in a world designed for righties. Let's walk through a day in the life of a historical lefty. Morning starts with getting dressed. Simple enough, right? Not if you're left-handed in earlier centuries. Buttons on men's clothing were placed for right-handed convenience. Laces, hooks, and other fastenings similarly favoured the right-handed majority. Even something as basic as getting dressed took extra effort and dexterity. Breakfast wasn't much better. Communal dining meant sitting elbow to elbow, and a left-handed person using their dominant hand would constantly bump the right arm of their neighbour. Many lefties were forced to eat awkwardly with their right hand or face social ostracism at every meal. Tools and implements for daily work were another nightmare. Everything from scissors to knives to farming tools were designed for right-handed users. Left-handed people using these tools would find them uncomfortable, less effective, or downright dangerous. Injury rates for left-handed workers using right-handed tools were significantly higher. Writing, as we've discussed, was particularly difficult. But it wasn't just school children who suffered. Adult left-handed scribes, clerks, and anyone else who needed to write faced the double challenge of social disapproval and practical difficulties with inkwells, quills, and parchment designed for right-handed users. In craftwork and trades, left-handed apprentices often couldn't find masters willing to train them, as the techniques had to be reversed. Those who did manage to learn a trade might find themselves unable to use standard tools or work alongside right-handed colleagues in cramped workshops. Even religion wasn't a refuge from these daily struggles. Many religious rituals specifically required using the right hand, from crossing oneself in Christianity to certain forms of Buddhist meditation. Left-handed people had to either awkwardly comply with their non-dominant hand or risk appearing impious. Social greetings like handshakes were standardized for right hands. A left-handed person offering their dominant hand for a greeting would be seen as rude or deliberately provocative in many historical contexts. These constant daily frictions and microaggressions might seem minor compared to being accused of witchcraft, but their cumulative effect on left-handed people's quality of life, self-esteem, and social integration was immense. Imagine going through life feeling awkward, clumsy, or wrong dozens of times every day, simply because the world wasn't built for you. How have creative works portrayed left-handedness throughout history? Let's examine the cultural mirror of art and literature to see how it both reflected and reinforced societal attitudes. In medieval and Renaissance art, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Devils, demons, and sinners were routinely portrayed as left-handed or performing evil deeds with their left hands. Artists carefully positioned figures in their paintings to show virtuous characters on the right side of the composition and villainous ones on the left. Even the concept of the left-hand path versus the right-hand path in esoteric traditions and literature reinforced this division. The right path leading to light and the divine, the left to darkness and forbidden knowledge. In literature, left-handedness often served as character shorthand for moral ambiguity, deception, or outright villainy. The trope of the sinister left-handed character, often marked by deformity of the left hand or arm, appears across cultures and centuries, from ancient myths to Victorian novels. Shakespeare, who reflected the social attitudes of his time, used gauche behaviour and left-side symbolism to highlight character flaws or impending doom. In Macbeth, The weird sisters stir their cauldron counterclockwise, while in several plays, characters explicitly reference the negative associations of the left side. Folk tales and children's stories often featured left-handed characters who were troublemakers, fools or villains. These stories served as warnings about the supposed link between left-handedness and moral corruption, helping to indoctrinate each new generation into anti-lefty prejudice. Yet fascinatingly, as artistic movements evolved and began to challenge societal norms, left-handedness occasionally became a symbol of rebellion, originality, or unconventional thinking. Some Romantic and later modernist writers reclaimed left-handedness as a mark of artistic temperament or genius outside conformist boundaries. Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass plays extensively with reversed-handedness and mirror imagery, perhaps reflecting his own experience as a natural lefty forced to convert. The entire premise of a mirror world where everything works backward can be read as a metaphor for the left-handed experience in a right-handed world. By the 20th century, some writers began explicitly challenging anti-left prejudice. James Thurber's humorous essays about his own left-handedness helped normalise the trait for many readers, while later authors incorporated left-handed characters whose handedness was simply one natural trait among many, rather than a symbol of moral failing. This evolution in artistic representation both reflected and influenced the gradual shift in societal attitudes toward left-handedness, from demonization to grudging acceptance to celebration of diversity. While being left-handed was usually a disadvantage in civilian life, on the battlefield, it sometimes offered surprising tactical advantages, though armies had complicated relationships with their left-handed soldiers. In hand-to-hand combat, left-handed fighters had a significant edge. Most warriors trained against right-handed opponents, developing muscle memory and techniques based on right-handed attack patterns. Facing a lefty threw these expectations into chaos. A left-handed swordsman would attack from unexpected angles, potentially confusing even highly trained opponents. Some historical accounts suggest left-handed fighters were specifically recruited for elite units because of this advantage. The Bible mentions the tribe of Benjamin having 700 elite left-handed slingers who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Roman gladiatorial schools allegedly valued left-handed fighters for their unpredictability in the arena. Medieval armies sometimes positioned left-handed archers and swordsmen strategically to create confusion in enemy ranks. The unexpected angle of attack from a left-handed fighter could break formation discipline and create openings for the rest of the force. However, this battlefield advantage came with significant drawbacks. Military equipment, from swords with asymmetrical hilts to shields designed to be carried in the left hand while fighting with the right, was standardized for right-handed use. Left-handed soldiers either had to adapt to right-handed equipment or have custom pieces made, which was expensive and often impractical. Group training presented another challenge. In tight formations, a left-handed soldier's movements would disrupt the coordinated actions of right-handed comrades. Many military drills assumed uniform right-handedness among troops. As firearms became dominant in warfare, the left-handed advantage diminished while the equipment disadvantages grew. Early guns were designed exclusively for right-handed operation, with loading procedures, sights, and ejection ports all favouring right-handed shooters. Left-handed soldiers firing right-handed weapons often suffered injuries from hot ejecting casings hitting their arms or faces. Despite these challenges, left-handed soldiers continued to serve, often developing creative adaptations to right-handed equipment and procedures. Some military historians speculate that the slightly higher proportion of ambidextrous people in historical military populations may reflect left-handed soldiers who developed right-handed abilities to conform to military standards, while retaining their natural left-handed skills for combat advantage. The military's complex relationship with left-handedness, simultaneously valuing its tactical advantage while engineering equipment that disadvantaged lefties, reflects broader societal ambivalence toward this natural variation in human ability. Beyond the physical hardships and practical challenges, centuries of discrimination left profound psychological scars on left-handed people. Let's explore the mental and emotional toll of being treated as wrong, sinister, or broken for your natural handedness. Forced conversion, being made to use your non-dominant hand through physical restraint, punishment, or constant correction, wasn't just physically uncomfortable. It was a form of neurological stress that had documented psychological effects. Studies of people who underwent forced right-hand training show higher rates of stuttering, difficulty with concentration, and symptoms resembling what we'd now recognise as anxiety and depression. Imagine being a child and having one of your most basic natural instincts, which hand to reach with, constantly corrected, punished, or treated as defective. The message sent to left-handed children throughout history was crystal clear. There is something fundamentally wrong with you that must be fixed. That's a devastating message to internalise during your formative years. Left-handed people historically reported feelings of shame, inadequacy, and anxiety around performing even simple tasks in public. The fear of being caught using their left hand, and the resulting punishment or mockery, created a constant state of hypervigilance that took a psychological toll. Many converted lefties developed what psychologists now recognise as a form of imposter syndrome, feeling like they were constantly faking their way through right-handed life and would be found out if they slipped up. Others described a profound sense of physical disconnection, as if their body didn't fully belong to them after being forced to use it in unnatural ways. The relentless messaging about left-handedness being sinister, evil, or wrong created deep-seated internal conflicts, especially in religious communities where children were simultaneously taught that God made them and that their natural hand preference was against God's will. Talk about theological whiplash. For those who resisted conversion or were fortunate enough to avoid it, there was still the psychological burden of constant othering, being marked as different, wrong, or suspect in countless daily interactions. The cumulative effect of microaggressions, from scissors that don't work properly to comments about using the wrong hand, created chronic stress that many left-handed people simply had to endure. What's particularly tragic is how this affected creativity and learning. Some educational psychologists believe the historical suppression of left-handedness may have prevented countless naturally left-handed children from reaching their full potential, as they spent mental energy fighting their natural inclinations rather than learning freely. The good news is that as social attitudes have changed, so has the psychological impact. Modern left-handed people who've been allowed to develop naturally report none of these psychological effects, proving that it wasn't left-handedness itself that caused problems, but the societal response to it. So when did things finally start to change? When did humanity begin to accept that maybe, just maybe, which hand you prefer to use isn't actually a sign of moral corruption or demonic influence? The shift began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though it was painfully gradual. Several factors contributed to this long overdue change in perspective. First came scientific advancement. As neurology and psychology developed as disciplines, researchers began to understand handedness as a natural biological variation rather than a defect or choice. Studies revealed that forcing children to switch handedness often led to developmental issues, evidence that finally challenged the practice of conversion. The educational reform movements of the early 20th century also played a crucial role. Progressive educators began advocating for child-centered approaches that respected natural development, including handedness. Pioneers like Maria Montessori explicitly opposed forced handedness conversion in their educational philosophies. World War I became an unexpected catalyst for change. The massive number of returning veterans with injuries to their right arms or hands needed to learn to use their left hands for writing and daily tasks. This created a sudden population of converted lefties who weren't stigmatized for their handedness, helping to normalize left-hand use in society. By the 1920s and 30s, the tide was turning in most Western countries. Child psychology experts began actively warning against forced conversion, citing the stuttering, anxiety, and learning difficulties it often caused. Schools gradually abandoned their anti-lefty policies, though many teachers continued informal discrimination well into the mid-20th century. In the UK, a watershed moment came in 1937 when King George VI, himself a converted lefty with a pronounced stutter, took the throne. His struggle with speech, likely worsened by forced right-hand training, brought national attention to the potential harms of the practice. The post-World War II emphasis on scientific rationalism further eroded superstitious fears about left-handedness. As Western societies became increasingly secular, religious objections to left-handedness lost much of their cultural power. By the 1960s, most schools in North America and Europe had officially abandoned forced conversion policies, though informal pressure and subtle discrimination persisted. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that left-handed children could generally expect to go through education without any pressure to switch hands. In many Asian countries, the transition came later, with Japan officially ending school policies against left-handedness only in the 1970s, and some parts of China maintaining conversion practices into the 1990s. What's remarkable isn't how quickly attitudes changed, but how stubbornly they persisted. From the first scientific papers challenging anti-left prejudice to general social acceptance took nearly a century, a testament to how deeply rooted this particular form of discrimination was in human culture. So we've come a long way from burning lefties as witches or forcing children to write with their right hands. Problem solved, right? Not quite. The shadows of anti-left prejudice still linger in subtle, and sometimes not so subtle as ways. Our language remains saturated with anti-left bias. We still use right to mean correct and proper, while sinister, gauche, and left-handed complement carry negative connotations. These linguistic fossils preserve ancient prejudices in our everyday speech, subtly reinforcing the right equals good, left equals bad association. The physical world continues to disadvantage left-handed people in countless small ways. Scissors, can openers, computer mice, keyboards, musical instruments, power tools, sports equipment. The list of right bias designs is endless. Each represents a tiny moment of frustration for lefties navigating a right-handed world. Educational materials still often contain subtle right-handed bias. Instructional diagrams typically show right-handed use, leaving left-handed students to mentally flip the image. Writing guides frequently neglect to address the specific challenges left-handed writers face with smudging and proper paper positioning. In some cultures, particularly across parts of the Middle East, Africa and Asia, strong taboos against using the left hand for eating, greeting or handing objects to others persist. Left-handed travellers or business people in these regions still face genuine social challenges if they use their dominant hand incorrectly. Religious rituals in many traditions continue to specifically require right-handed actions, from the Catholic sign of the cross to Hindu puja ceremonies. These requirements force left-handed adherents to either use their non-dominant hand or feel like they're somehow worshipping incorrectly. Perhaps most insidious are the subtle societal biases that research shows still exist. Studies reveal that left-handed people are still sometimes perceived as less trustworthy or competent in professional settings. The stereotype of the clumsy, awkward lefty persists in popular imagination, affecting how left-handed people are perceived and treated. Some sports and competitive activities still contain structural biases against left-handed participants. While being a southpaw can be an advantage in boxing or baseball, in sports like polo, field hockey, and golf, left-handed play is either disadvantaged or explicitly prohibited by equipment design or rules. Even in healthcare, left-handed patients sometimes face challenges. Medical equipment is typically designed for right-handed use, and some medical professionals are inadequately trained in adapting procedures for left-handed patients. What makes these modern remnants particularly frustrating is that they're largely unnecessary. With awareness and inclusive design, most of these issues could be easily resolved, but they persist because right-handed people, roughly 90% of the population, simply don't notice them, while left-handed people have been conditioned to adapt rather than complain. The good news is that awareness is slowly growing, and some companies now specifically create left-handed versions of products. But we're still a long way from a truly handedness-neutral world. So what can the strange and dark history of left-handed persecution teach us? Beyond being a fascinating journey through human superstition and prejudice, there are deeper lessons worth reflecting on. First, it reveals our remarkable capacity to assign moral meaning to completely neutral biological traits. Left-handedness isn't good or bad, it's just a variation in human neurology, like eye colour or height. Yet for thousands of years, cultures worldwide decided it was a moral failing, a spiritual corruption, or a defect to be corrected. Sound familiar? Throughout history, We've done the same with countless other human variations, from skin colour to gender expression to neurological differences. The story of left-handedness serves as a microcosm of humanity's broader tendency to fear and suppress difference rather than embrace diversity. Second, it shows the incredible power of early cultural associations to persist long after their original context has vanished. Most modern people don't believe left-handedness has anything to do with demons or moral corruption, yet our language and many of our practices still carry the imprint of those ancient fears. These cultural echoes can harm people for generations after the original superstitions have been discredited. Third, it highlights how institutions, from religious organisations to educational systems, can codify and enforce arbitrary discrimination, giving personal prejudices the weight of official policy. The transformation of folksy superstition into formalised discrimination through school rules, legal codes, and religious doctrine shows how easily fear of difference becomes systemic oppression. Perhaps most importantly, the story of left-handedness reveals both how deeply resistant to change human prejudices can be, and that change is nonetheless possible. It took centuries of struggle, but today's left-handed children grow up without the shame, pain, and forced conversion their ancestors endured. Progress happens, even if it happens frustratingly slowly. Speaking of strange superstitions and mass hysteria, I want to shift gears to another fascinating historical mystery that connects perfectly with what we've been discussing. While left-handed people were being persecuted as witches, something else was literally baking in the background that might explain why witch hunts happened in the first place. Let's dive into the bizarre story of how contaminated bread may have fueled some of history's most infamous witch trials. Picture this. It's 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. Young girls are suddenly convulsing, contorting their bodies into impossible positions, screaming that invisible forces are tormenting them. Their symptoms spread like wildfire through the community. Within months, 20 people are executed for witchcraft, and a quiet New England village becomes synonymous with paranoia and persecution. For centuries, historians blamed this on everything from teenage boredom to political conspiracies to actual belief in witchcraft. But what if the explanation was sitting on the dinner table the whole time? Enter ergot, a fungus that infects rye and related grains, turning ordinary bread into an unintentional psychedelic nightmare. This isn't just any mould. Ergot produces powerful compounds called ergot alkaloids, which are chemically similar to LSD. Yes, the same LSD that fueled acid trips in the 1960s was essentially growing on medieval bread in a natural form. When consumed, ergot alkaloids can cause hallucinations, convulsions, burning sensations, gangrene, and in severe cases, death. But the psychological symptoms are particularly intriguing. Paranoia, delusions, and the sensation of being pinched, bitten, or pricked by invisible assailants. Sound familiar? These match many witch trial accounts with eerie precision. The Salem witch trials aren't the only historical event potentially linked to ergot. Similar outbreaks of dancing mania in medieval Europe, where thousands of people danced uncontrollably until they collapsed from exhaustion, may have had the same fungal origin. What makes ergot especially sneaky is that not everyone who eats contaminated grain will be affected equally. Children and women appear more susceptible to its effects, which might explain why the afflicted in many witch panics were disproportionately young girls and women. So as we begin this journey into one of history's most bizarre botanical conspiracies, keep this in mind. Sometimes, the line between supernatural fear and natural phenomenon is as thin as a slice of bread. Let's get to know our villain properly. Ergot isn't your everyday kitchen mould. It's a sophisticated parasite with a life cycle perfectly designed to cause human misery. The fungus begins its life cycle when its spores land on the open flowers of grasses, particularly rye. It then infiltrates the developing grain, replacing it with a hard, dark structure called a sclerotium, essentially a fungal command centre. These appear as purplish-black curved structures extending from the grain heads, looking somewhat like a witch's finger, ironically enough. When harvested alongside healthy grain and ground into flour, these ergot bodies release their toxic alkaloids into the food supply. Medieval farmers and millers might have noticed the discoloured grains, but during famines or poor harvests, people were less likely to discard any food, contaminated or not. What makes ergot especially dangerous is its seasonal and geographical pickiness. It thrives in cool, damp conditions followed by warm, humid weather, exactly the climate pattern preceding the Salem witch trials of 1692. Historical weather records show that the years before, the trials featured exactly these conditions in New England. Even more telling, ergot contamination tends to be localized. One field might be devastated while another nearby remains untouched, explaining why certain communities experienced bewitchment while neighbouring towns remained unaffected. In Salem, the affected girls primarily came from the western, agricultural part of the village, where rye was commonly grown. The chemical arsenal inside ergot is impressive and terrifying. It produces ergotamine and ergometrin, compounds still used in controlled doses in modern medicine for migraines and to stop post-childbirth bleeding. But it also creates lysergic acid compounds, close relatives of LSD, alongside vasoconstrictors that can cause gangrene by restricting blood flow to extremities. For the average medieval or colonial person, consuming ergot-contaminated food meant experiencing a nightmarish combination of painful physical symptoms and mind-altering psychological effects, all with no understanding of the actual cause. When your neighbours start hallucinating demonic encounters while their fingers and toes blacken and fall off, supernatural explanations don't seem so far-fetched after all. Ergotism, the proper name for ergot poisoning, has a long and gruesome history across Europe and later in colonial America. The earliest recorded epidemic dates back to 857 CE in the Rhine Valley, where thousands suddenly experienced the burning sensations, convulsions and hallucinations characteristic of the condition. By the Middle Ages, ergotism had become common enough to earn the name Holy Fire or St. Anthony's Fire, because sufferers would pray to St. Anthony for relief from the burning sensations. Entire hospitals called St. Anthony's Hospitals were established across Europe specifically to treat this mysterious affliction. These medieval hospitals recognised the connection to bread. Patients were fed a clean diet without rye, though they didn't understand the fungal cause. One of the most dramatic documented outbreaks occurred in 994 CE in Limoges, France, when over 40,000 people died from ergot poisoning. The gangrenous form of ergotism would cause limbs to blacken, shrivel and eventually fall off, often leaving survivors as amputees if they managed to live through the ordeal. The dancing manias that periodically swept through Europe from the 14th to 17th centuries present another fascinating potential ergot connection. In 1518, let's look more closely at the most famous possible ergot outbreak, the Salem witch trials of 1692. The story begins with two young girls, the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Parris, who began experiencing strange convulsions, contortions and complaints of being pinched and pricked by invisible tormentors. Their symptoms soon spread to other girls in the community. Under pressure to explain their suffering, the girls accused three women of bewitching them: Tituba, the Parris family's Caribbean slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by marrying her servant. From these initial accusations, hysteria spread until 19 people were hanged. One was pressed to death with stones, and at least 5 more died in prison. The ergot theory for Salem, first proposed by behavioral psychologist Linda Caporael in 1976, points to several compelling pieces of evidence. First, the symptoms reported by the afflicted girls match ergot poisoning with uncanny precision. Convulsive fits, sensations of being pricked or bitten, hallucinations and crawling sensations under the skin. Second, Salem village experienced precisely the weather conditions that promote ergot growth. A warm, wet spring and summer in 1691, followed by a harsh winter and then a damp spring in 1692 when the accusations began. These conditions would have been perfect for ergot development in the rye fields. Third, the geographic distribution of the accusers is telling. Most of the afflicted girls lived in the western agricultural section of Salem village, where rye was commonly grown, while fewer cases appeared in the eastern, more commercially oriented section of town where imported grain would have been more common. Finally, the Salem trials ended almost as abruptly as they began, coinciding with the harvest of a new, presumably uncontaminated crop of grain in the fall of 1692. As the village's food supply changed, the fits and accusations gradually subsided. While ergot alone can't explain the complex social, religious and political factors that allowed the Salem trials to reach such deadly proportions, it offers a compelling explanation for the initial physical symptoms that triggered the panic. The girls weren't lying. They were truly experiencing terrifying symptoms. They just blamed the wrong cause. To truly understand how a humble bread mould could trigger witch hunts, we need to dive into the fascinating chemistry of ergot. What exactly are these compounds, and how do they hijack the human brain and body so dramatically? Ergot produces a family of chemical compounds called ergot alkaloids. The main players include ergotamine, ergometrine, and most importantly for our witchy discussion, lysergic acid. If that last one sounds vaguely familiar, it should. Lysergic acid is the precursor to lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as LSD. In fact, Albert Hofmann discovered LSD in 1938 while researching potential medical uses for ergot alkaloids. These compounds work their dark magic by binding to neurotransmitter receptors in the brain, particularly serotonin and dopamine receptors. The result is a biochemical hijacking of your perception, mood, and bodily control. At lower doses, they cause hallucinations, sensory distortions, and mood changes ranging from euphoria to terror. At higher doses, they can trigger convulsions, painful muscle contractions, and vascular constriction severe enough to cause gangrene. What makes ergot particularly insidious is that its effects aren't consistent. The concentration of alkaloids varies wildly depending on growing conditions, storage, and cooking methods. This means one loaf of bread might cause mild symptoms while another from the same batch could trigger severe poisoning. Some family members might appear afflicted while others seemed spared, a pattern that would have reinforced notions of selective demonic possession. There are even two distinct forms of ergotism: gangrenous and convulsive. Gangrenous ergotism, more common in adults, causes vascular constriction leading to the blackening and eventual loss of extremities. Convulsive ergotism, more common in children and younger women, produces the seizures, muscle spasms and hallucinations more typically associated with bewitchment. It's worth noting that children and women of childbearing age appear to be more susceptible to ergot's neurological effects due to differences in body weight, metabolism, and possibly hormonal factors. This biological quirk helps explain why the afflicted in witch trials were so often young girls rather than adult men. The psychoactive properties of ergot weren't entirely unknown to ancient cultures. Some historians believe that ergot-containing beverages may have been deliberately used in certain ancient Greek religious rituals, including possibly the famous oracle at Delphi. But for medieval and colonial communities, these same effects arriving unintentionally through the daily bread would have seemed nothing short of demonic. Bread wasn't just a food in medieval and colonial times, it was the food. The average European might get 70 to 80% of their calories from bread and grain products. A farming family in colonial New England would consume about a pound of bread per person per day. This dietary reliance on a single food source created the perfect conditions for widespread ergot poisoning when crops became contaminated. Rye was particularly important in northern Europe and colonial New England because it grows better than wheat in poor soils and harsh climates. Unfortunately, rye is also the grain most susceptible to ergot infection. This helps explain why ergotism was more common in certain regions. The geography of madness followed the geography of rye cultivation. The entire bread-making process inadvertently concentrated ergot's effects in several ways. When harvesting grain, the ergot sclerosia, those dark, horn-like fungal structures, would be collected alongside the healthy grain. During threshing and milling, they would be ground into the flour, spreading their alkaloids throughout. Baking doesn't necessarily destroy ergot alkaloids either. They're remarkably heat-stable compounds, capable of surviving oven temperatures, especially in larger loaves where the interior doesn't get as hot. Some alkaloids might break down, but enough would remain to cause symptoms. In fact, certain cooking processes may have actually converted some compounds into more potent forms. Storage conditions played a crucial role too. In years with poor harvests, communities would stretch their grain supplies further into the following spring and summer. The longest stored grain was often the mouldiest and most likely to be contaminated with ergot. This explains the seasonal pattern of many ergotism outbreaks. They frequently occurred in spring just before the new harvest, when people were eating the last and worst of the previous year's grain. social inequality magnified the effects of ergot contamination. In times of scarcity, the highest quality, least contaminated grain would go to the wealthy, while poorer families got the leftovers with higher ergot concentrations. This economic dimension of ergotism helps explain why accusations of witchcraft often moved up the social ladder. The affected poor would first experience symptoms themselves, then observe that the wealthy seemed mysteriously unaffected, leading to suspicions of magical protection or devil's bargains. The bread connection reveals a tragic irony. The very staff of life became at times a vector for terror, suffering, and social disintegration. The overlap between ergot poisoning symptoms and historical descriptions of bewitchment is so striking that it's almost eerie. Let's compare them side by side and see how a fungal infection could have been mistaken for supernatural assault. First, the physical symptoms. Ergotism frequently causes muscle spasms, convulsions, and contortions, exactly matching accounts of afflicted people in witch trials who are described as being thrown into strange postures and exorbitant convulsions. The painful burning sensations of ergotism align with victims' claims of being burned or pricked by invisible forces. The sensation of insects crawling under the skin, a common ergot symptom called formication, appears in numerous witch trial testimonies. Victims would scratch frantically at nothing, claiming they felt invisible creatures biting them, a description that makes perfect medical sense when viewed through the lens of ergotism. Even more compelling are the neurological and psychological effects. Ergot poisoning causes hallucinations that often involve animals, exactly matching the spectral familiars that accusers claim to see accompanying witches. Victims of ergotism often experience frightening visual distortions, including seeing people's faces become demonic or animal-like, potentially explaining why accusers would claim that respected community members transformed into monstrous forms before their eyes. The temporary blindness, deafness, and muteness reported in many witch trials are also consistent with ergot's neurological effects. In Salem, some of the afflicted girls temporarily lost their sight, hearing, or ability to speak, symptoms that medical records now recognize as possible consequences of ergot poisoning. Even the social pattern of bewitchment matches ergotism's spread. Because families shared food supplies, multiple members of the same household would develop symptoms simultaneously, reinforcing the impression that a witch was targeting specific families. As neighbours shared contaminated food, or ate from the same contaminated fields, the bewitchment would appear to spread from house to house like contagion. The age and gender distribution is particularly telling. In many witch panics, young girls and women were disproportionately among the afflicted. This matches the observed pattern in ergotism, where children and young women seem most susceptible to the convulsive form of the poisoning. Perhaps most convincing are the seasonal patterns. Witch accusations often peaked in late winter and spring, precisely when communities would be consuming the last and most potentially contaminated portions of the previous year's grain harvest. While Salem gets all the attention, ergot may have fueled mass hysteria in numerous other historical episodes. Let's explore some of the most compelling cases across different times and places. The Loudun possessions in the 1630s. France present a fascinating example. Nuns at a Ursuline convent experienced violent convulsions, obscene outbursts, and claims of demonic possession. They accused a local priest, Urbain Grandier, who was subsequently tortured and burned at the stake. The convent's diet was largely grain-based, and the region was known for rye cultivation. The symptoms, including hallucinations of sexual assault by demons, align remarkably well with ergot poisoning. In 1951, in the French village of Pont-Saint-Esprit, over 200 people suddenly experienced hallucinations, burning sensations, and convulsions. Officially attributed to mercury-contaminated bread at the time, recent investigations suggest this mass madness was likely an ergot outbreak, arguably the last major one in Western Europe. Villagers reported terrifying visions of being attacked by tigers or turning into plants, classic examples of the vivid hallucinations caused by ergot alkaloids. The Northern European witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries show a compelling geographic correlation with rye-growing regions. Areas like Scandinavia, northern Germany and Scotland, all heavily dependent on rye, saw significantly more intense witch hunts than southern European countries where wheat was the dominant grain. Some historians have even suggested that ergotism might explain certain religious visions and mystic experiences. The hallucinations of medieval mystics sometimes included sensations of burning or painful prickling alongside their spiritual visions, symptoms consistent with mild ergot poisoning. The 1692 witch trials in Fairfield, Connecticut present another American case with potential ergot connections. The pattern of accusations, symptoms and timing closely resembles Salem, suggesting a similar fungal trigger. Connecticut, like Massachusetts, relied heavily on rye cultivation, in areas with the wet, cool conditions favourable to ergot growth. Even the notorious European dancing manias deserve another look through the ergot lens. During these episodes, hundreds or thousands of people would dance uncontrollably for days on end, often until they collapsed from exhaustion. While cultural explanations abound, the involuntary muscle movements, hallucinations and psychosis described in these events match ergot's neurological effects remarkably well. What makes these cases particularly compelling isn't just the symptom match, but their geographic and seasonal patterns. They overwhelmingly occurred in rye-growing regions and often peaked during the spring months, when stored grain would be at its oldest and most susceptible to contamination. The ergot theory isn't without its critics, and responsible history demands we look at alternative explanations and limitations. Let's examine the scholarly debate around this fungal theory of bewitchment. The most common criticism points to the absence of physical ergotism symptoms in many witch panic accounts. While Salem accusers reported convulsions and sensations of being pricked, they didn't generally report the gangrenous symptoms also associated with ergot poisoning. However, this objection overlooks the fact that ergotism has two distinct forms, convulsive and gangrenous, with the convulsive form being more common in children and young women, exactly the demographic most represented among the afflicted. Some historians argue that ergot can't explain the targeted nature of accusations. Why would the Salem girls accuse specific individuals rather than seeing demons randomly? This overlooks the power of suggestion and community dynamics. Once initial hallucinations occurred, community expectations, leading questions from authorities, and social pressures would naturally channel those experiences into the familiar framework of witchcraft accusations. Cultural historians point out that witch panics often coincided with periods of social stress, religious conflict, or economic hardship, suggesting psychological rather than chemical causes. But this might represent a false dichotomy. Ergot poisoning could have provided the initial neurological symptoms that were then interpreted and amplified through cultural lenses during already stressful times. Another objection notes that ergot alone doesn't explain why witch hunts ended in the 18th century despite continued rye cultivation. This ignores agricultural improvements that reduced ergot contamination, including better grain storage, changing crop rotation practices, and increased understanding of grain diseases. Medical historians sometimes argue that if ergot were the cause, symptoms should have been more widespread across entire communities. This overlooks the patchy nature of ergot contamination and variations in individual susceptibility. Not everyone would eat the same bread, and not everyone who consumed ergot would react identically. Some Salem-specific critiques note that the accusations continued beyond the harvest of new grain, in fall 1692, when fresh supplies should have ended the poisoning. However, the worst of the hysteria did abate then, and remaining accusations might represent the social momentum of witch hunting rather than continued poisoning. Perhaps the most valid criticism is that the ergot theory risks oversimplifying complex historical events. Ergot may have provided initial symptoms in some cases, but the progression to full witch hunts required specific cultural, religious and social contexts that varied across communities. Beyond the specific chemistry of ergot, there's a fascinating broader question at play. How does biology interact with culture to create mass hysteria? The ergot theory offers a window into understanding how physical symptoms can trigger widespread social panic. At its core, fear operates in a feedback loop between our bodies and our minds. Physical symptoms like increased heart rate, muscle tension, or strange sensations trigger psychological fear responses. These fear responses then amplify physical symptoms, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. In the case of ergot poisoning, initial neurological symptoms would trigger fear, which would then exacerbate both the perception and reality of those symptoms. Mass psychogenic illness, what we once called mass hysteria, builds on this individual feedback loop but adds social contagion. When people observe others experiencing symptoms of distress, they become more likely to experience and report similar symptoms themselves. This is a documented phenomenon even without any chemical trigger like ergot. Various outbreaks have been recorded in factories, schools, and other communal settings where symptoms spread rapidly, despite no identifiable physical cause. Now imagine this natural human tendency towards social contagion, amplified by actual poisoning. The initial ergot victims would experience genuine neurological symptoms. Others, watching these disturbing episodes, might then develop sympathetic symptoms through psychological mechanisms. Both groups would interpret their experiences through the available cultural framework. In this case, supernatural attack and witchcraft. Cultural priming plays a crucial role too. Communities steeped in witchcraft belief would readily interpret unusual physical or mental states as evidence of bewitchment. Ministers regularly preached about the devil's power and the danger of witches, essentially preloading a particular explanation for any strange occurrences. When unusual symptoms appeared, whether from ergot or other causes, this cultural priming directed how they would be interpreted. The authority figures in these communities, primarily religious leaders and physicians, often reinforced rather than questioned these interpretations. In Salem, ministers explicitly encouraged the search for witches among the townsfolk. Physicians, lacking alternative explanations for the strange symptoms, frequently concluded that the afflictions were preternatural, beyond natural cause and therefore supernatural. This complex interplay between actual poisoning symptoms, psychological contagion, cultural frameworks, and authority validation helps explain why ergot poisoning might trigger witch accusations in one context, but be interpreted entirely differently in another time or place. Ergot's connections to madness, visions, and social upheaval have left fascinating traces in art and literature, sometimes in ways the creators themselves didn't fully recognize. Let's explore how this fearsome fungus infiltrated cultural expressions across the centuries. Medieval art frequently depicted sufferers of St. Anthony's fire with blackened or missing limbs, surrounded by flames, a literal representation of the burning sensations and gangrene caused by ergot poisoning. St. Anthony himself became associated with mushrooms in religious iconography, a connection that puzzled art historians until the ergot St. Anthony's fire link became clear. Hieronymus Bosch's disturbing masterpiece, The Temptation of St. Anthony, may draw inspiration from ergot hallucinations. The painting's grotesque creatures, distorted perspectives, and nightmarish quality bear striking resemblance to descriptions of ergot-induced visions. Some art historians believe Bosch might have witnessed ergotism outbreaks, incorporating the disturbing hallucinations described by victims into his work. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, a classic tale about a Salem resident who encounters a witch's Sabbath in the forest, takes on new dimensions when read through the ergot lens. The protagonist's uncertain state, is he dreaming or witnessing reality, mirrors the confusion of ergot hallucinations, where victims cannot distinguish vision from reality. In modern literature, Robin Cook's 1994 novel Acceptable Risk directly explores the Ergot-Salem connection through a scientist who discovers that ergot was behind the witch trials. Philippa Gregory's historical novel Tidelands features a protagonist accused of witchcraft while experiencing symptoms consistent with ergot poisoning. Ergot's connections to visionary experiences may extend to more celebrated artistic outputs as well. Some scholars have suggested that certain religious mystics' visions, with their vivid imagery and painful physical manifestations, might have been influenced by unintentional ergot consumption. The ecstatic religious art inspired by these visions could thus be, in part, artistic renderings of fungus-induced hallucinations. Even Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with its size distortions, bizarre creatures, and dreamlike logic, has been speculatively connected to ergot by some literary analysts. While there's no direct evidence Carroll was influenced by ergot poisoning, the similarity between Alice's perceptual distortions and the documented effects of ergot alkaloids is striking. Horror cinema has occasionally touched on the theme directly, with films like The Cursed explicitly connecting ergot poisoning to werewolf legends and mass hysteria in a 19th century French village. These artistic explorations of ergot's effects, whether conscious or unconscious, reveal how deeply this fungal menace penetrated cultural consciousness, shaping our very concepts of madness, visions, and supernatural experience. Reframing witch hunts as public health crises rather than purely social or religious phenomena opens fascinating new perspectives on these historical tragedies. Medical anthropology gives us tools to understand how societies interpret illness through available cultural frameworks, in this case, the framework of demonic influence and witchcraft. When unexplained symptoms appear in a community, people naturally seek explanations and solutions. In pre-scientific societies, supernatural causes often provided the most accessible explanation for clusters of strange symptoms. The witch hunt, in this view, becomes a misguided public health response, an attempt to address genuine suffering through the removal of its perceived source. Physicians in these periods often reinforced rather than challenged supernatural interpretations. When confronted with the convulsions, hallucinations, and sensory distortions of ergotism, colonial doctors like those in Salem frequently declared the cause preternatural, meaning beyond natural explanation. This medical validation of supernatural causes gave institutional support to witch hunting. The pattern of witch accusations often followed what we now recognise as disease vectors. In communities sharing food sources, accusations typically clustered in neighbourhoods or extended families, exactly the pattern we would expect from food-borne illness. When accusations leapt across social or geographic boundaries, they often did so through shared meals or food gifts that could have transferred contaminated grain products. Children's particular vulnerability to both the convulsive form of ergotism and social suggestion helps explain their prominent role as accusers in many witch panics. Their genuine physical symptoms would be interpreted by adults through the lens of bewitchment, and their subsequent behaviour would be shaped by these adult interpretations and expectations. The medical mismanagement of these crises often made them worse. Treatments for bewitchment included prayer, fasting, and sometimes physical restraint, interventions that would do nothing to address ergot poisoning and might exacerbate psychological distress. Meanwhile, the one intervention that might have helped, changing the food supply, was rarely attempted because the connection to grain wasn't recognised. Modern parallels exist in communities where unusual illness clusters are initially attributed to environmental toxins, government conspiracies, or other external causes before scientific investigation identifies the true source. The human tendency to seek external agents responsible for suffering remains consistent across centuries, even as our specific explanatory frameworks evolve. This medical anthropology perspective doesn't diminish the real social, political, and religious factors in witch hunts, but it adds a crucial biological dimension that helps explain why certain communities experienced these panics while similar neighbouring villages remained unaffected. Despite its terrifying history, ergot has had a surprisingly important role in the development of modern medicine. Its journey from poison to pharmaceutical illuminates how even the most dangerous substances can sometimes be harnessed for healing. Ergot's first documented medicinal use dates back to the 16th century Europe, where midwives used small amounts to induce labour and control postpartum bleeding. This practice was dangerous given the variable potency of natural ergot and the fine line between therapeutic and toxic doses, but it recognised the powerful effects of ergot alkaloids on uterine muscle. In 1708, American physician John Stearns published the first medical paper formally documenting ergot's use in obstetrics, calling it pulvis parturiens. By the mid-19th century, ergot extracts had become standard in Western medical practice for controlling hemorrhage, despite growing concerns about their safety. The modern pharmaceutical era of ergot began in 1918, when Arthur Stoll isolated ergotamine, the first pure ergot alkaloid. This breakthrough allowed for standardized dosing and fewer side effects. Ergotamine became a staple treatment for migraines, a use that continues today in some specialized medications. The most significant medical development came in 1943, when Albert Hofmann, working with ergot derivatives at Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, accidentally absorbed some LSD. a compound he had synthesized from ergot alkaloids. His subsequent deliberate self-experiment with LSD opened an entirely new chapter in psychopharmacology. Methylogometrine, another ergot derivative, remains an essential medication on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines for preventing postpartum hemorrhage. In developing countries, this ergot-derived drug saves countless lives by preventing bleeding after childbirth. Bromocriptine, yet another ergot derivative, is used to treat Parkinson's disease, certain pituitary tumours, and type 2 diabetes. Its ability to act on dopamine receptors makes it valuable for conditions involving dopamine dysregulation. The study of ergot alkaloids' effects on neurotransmitter receptors has provided crucial insights into brain function. Our understanding of serotonin, dopamine, and other neurotransmitter systems owes much to research on how ergot compounds interact with these systems. Even LSD, despite its controversial history, has contributed to neuropsychiatric research. Recent clinical trials are exploring its potential for treating depression, anxiety, and addiction, returning to therapeutic applications after decades of prohibition. The pharmaceutical significance of ergot represents a remarkable historical irony. The same fungus that may have triggered witch hunts and mass hysteria also gave rise to medications that have saved millions of lives. The compounds once feared as agents of the devil became tools of healing once science replaced superstition as our framework for understanding. This medical evolution of ergot from poison to prescription exemplifies how scientific understanding can transform our relationship with the natural world, finding value and healing potential in substances once feared as purely harmful. You might be thinking this is all fascinating ancient history, but surely modern food safety standards have eliminated ergot poisoning, right? Not entirely. While rare in developed countries now, ergot poisoning still occurs in the modern world, particularly in developing regions with less regulated agriculture. The most recent major confirmed outbreak occurred in Ethiopia in 2001, when 93 people were hospitalized with symptoms of gangrenous ergotism after consuming contaminated grain. Smaller clusters of cases have been reported in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America in recent decades, usually following poor harvests when quality control measures are sometimes relaxed out of necessity. Even in developed countries, rare cases still appear. A suspected ergotism case was reported in New York State in the 1980s, and occasional cases emerge in rural areas of Eastern Europe. Modern medicine now recognizes and treats these cases appropriately, but the initial symptoms still often confuse doctors unfamiliar with this rare condition. Modern grain processing offers significant protection. Commercial mills use colour sorters, gravity separators, and other technologies to remove ergot bodies from grain. Strict regulatory limits exist for ergot contamination levels in commercial food products. In the United States, grain with more than 0.05% ergot content is considered unfit for human consumption. Climate change potentially complicates the picture. The wet springs and warm summers that favour ergot growth may become more common in certain grain-growing regions, potentially increasing the risk of contamination. Some plant pathologists have raised concerns about changing patterns of ergot infection in response to shifting climate conditions. Homegrown and artisanal grain products represent another potential risk point. The recent trends toward local food, home milling, and heritage grains are generally positive, but they sometimes bypass the industrial safeguards that remove ergot. Small-scale farmers and hobbyists may not recognise ergot or understand its significance. While we're unlikely to see Salem-scale ergotism outbreaks in developed countries again, the fungus itself remains present in our environment. Ergot still regularly infects rye and other grains worldwide. The difference now is our awareness and prevention measures, not the elimination of the fungus itself. This persistent presence of ergot serves as a humbling reminder. The natural compounds that once drove communities to execute their neighbours still exist in our environment. What's changed is not the fungus, but our framework for understanding it, from demonic possession to mycotoxicology. The difference between a medical case and a witch trial is primarily one of knowledge, not nature. The ergot theory of witch panics raises broader questions about mass hysteria throughout history and into the present day. If fungal poisoning could help trigger witch hunts, What other medical misunderstandings might lie behind similar episodes of mass panic? The dancing plagues of medieval Europe, where hundreds or thousands of people danced uncontrollably, sometimes until they died from exhaustion, have been variously attributed to ergot poisoning, stress-induced psychosis, or religious ecstasy. The truth likely involves multiple factors, potentially including food contamination alongside psychological and social elements. More recent episodes of mass psychogenic illness show similar patterns without any known toxin involvement. In 1962, a mysterious laughing epidemic spread through a girls' school in Tanganyika, eventually affecting nearly 1,000 people with uncontrollable laughing, crying, and agitation. The episode lasted over a year and closed multiple schools. Modern analysis suggests this was a case of a mass psychogenic illness triggered by stress and anxiety in a highly pressured school environment. The 2011 case in Leroy, New York, where multiple high school students suddenly developed Tourette-like tics and convulsions, bears striking resemblance to historical witch panics. Despite extensive medical testing finding no environmental cause, the similarity to ergot symptoms is notable, though no evidence of ergot was found, and most experts concluded it was mass psychogenic illness. What these cases share with possible ergot-influenced witch hunts is the interaction between physical symptoms and social amplification. Initial symptoms in a few individuals get interpreted through available cultural frameworks, then spread through social contagion and media attention. The frameworks change, from witchcraft in colonial times to environmental toxins or mysterious illnesses today, but the pattern of fear amplification remains remarkably consistent. When faced with unexplained symptoms, humans reach for explanations that fit their worldview and often identify external agents to blame. Social media has become a modern vector for these phenomena. The recent rise in social media-influenced psychogenic conditions, such as the documented increase in Tourette-like symptoms in teenagers during the COVID-19 pandemic, demonstrates how transmission mechanisms evolve while underlying psychological processes remain similar. What the ergot theory offers to our understanding of these phenomena is the recognition that real physical triggers might sometimes initiate what then develops into primarily psychological and social episodes. The boundary between real and imagined illness is often more porous than we like to admit. This perspective encourages humility when evaluating historical or contemporary outbreaks of unusual symptoms. Like our ancestors, we remain vulnerable to both biological toxins and social contagion, even if our explanatory frameworks have evolved. The ergot theory of witch panics represents a fascinating case study in interdisciplinary history. How combining knowledge from fields as diverse as mycology, chemistry, meteorology, and historical research can transform our understanding of the past. But it also highlights how easily crucial aspects of history can remain hidden when we lack the right interpretive framework. For centuries, historians analysed witch trials primarily through religious, social, and political lenses. These approaches yielded valuable insights but missed the potential biological dimension. Without knowledge of ergot's effects, historians simply had no reason to note weather patterns before witch trials or the prevalence of rye in affected communities' diets. The first person to propose a connection between ergot and witchcraft was Mary Kilbourne Matosian in the 1970s, followed by Linda Caporale's more detailed Salem-specific analysis in 1976. Despite initial skepticism from traditional historians, the theory has gained significant scholarly attention, even from those who don't fully accept it. This represents a remarkable shift in how we approach historical events, recognizing that biological, environmental, and medical factors may deeply influence historical events typically explained in purely social terms. This interdisciplinary breakthrough reminds us to question our compartmentalized approach to knowledge. How many other historical phenomena might look different if examined through multiple disciplinary lenses simultaneously? Political upheavals during periods of food scarcity might reflect not just economic hardship, but specific cognitive effects of malnutrition. Religious movements featuring unusual physical manifestations might connect to environmental exposures or disease outbreaks. The ergot theory also challenges our tendency to assume historical accounts were exaggerated or fabricated when they describe phenomena outside our normal experience. For centuries, scholars dismissed witch trial accounts of convulsing victims and bizarre sensory experiences as hysteria or fabrication. Understanding ergot's effects allows us to recognise that witnesses might have been accurately reporting genuine, if misinterpreted, physical symptoms. Perhaps most importantly, the ergot theory invites us to approach historical actors with greater empathy. The magistrates and ministers who conducted witch trials were not simply cruel or superstitious by modern standards. They were attempting to address genuinely terrifying situations using the best explanatory tools available to them. Similarly, the afflicted accusers were not simply lying or seeking attention. Many were likely experiencing frightening and painful symptoms beyond their control. This more nuanced understanding doesn't excuse the executions that resulted from witch trials, but it does help us comprehend how well-intentioned communities could perpetrate such tragedies, and perhaps helps us reflect on what similar blind spots might exist in our own attempt to make sense of unexplained phenomena. The historical connection between ergot and witch trials represents just one chapter in humanity's complex relationship with psychoactive substances. Throughout history, plants and fungi with mind-altering properties have shaped religious practices, medical treatments, social policies, and cultural movements, often in ways unrecognised until modern scientific understanding emerged. Ergot alkaloids belong to a broader class of compounds called psychedelics, which profoundly alter consciousness by interacting with serotonin receptors in the brain. Many traditional cultures worldwide use psychedelic plants and fungi in religious and healing contexts, from peyote among Native American groups to ayahuasca in the Amazon and psilocybin mushrooms across multiple continents. When these substances were used deliberately in ritual contexts, with cultural frameworks for interpreting their effects, they typically produced experiences described as spiritual or meaningful. But when encountered accidentally through contaminated food, without such frameworks, the same compounds could generate terror and confusion, as likely happened with ergot poisoning. The mid-20th century saw a scientific revolution in understanding these compounds. Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD in 1943 initiated an explosion of research into psychedelics. Between the 1940s and 1960s, thousands of scientific papers were published on their potential therapeutic applications for depression, addiction, trauma, and end-of-life anxiety. This scientific exploration was largely halted by the political and cultural backlash of the 1960s and 70s, when psychedelics became associated with counterculture movements. Many of these compounds, including LSD, were criminalized, and research was essentially frozen for decades. Remarkably, the early 21st century has seen a renaissance in psychedelic research, with clinical trials at major medical institutions investigating compounds related to those that may have triggered witch hunts. Current research at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and other prestigious institutions suggest these substances may have significant therapeutic potential for conditions including treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and addiction. This scientific evolution represents a profound shift in how we relate to consciousness-altering compounds. From fearing them as demonic influences to studying them as potential medicines, our relationship with these substances embodies the broader journey from superstition to science. The witch trial connection adds a poignant historical footnote to this story. The same class of compounds that once led communities to execute their neighbours as witches is now being carefully investigated as a potential healing tool for mental health conditions. Few examples more powerfully illustrate how profoundly our interpretive frameworks shape our relationship with the natural world and with each other. This doesn't mean these substances are without risks. They remain powerful compounds, requiring careful use and research, but it does highlight how dramatically scientific understanding can transform our relationship with phenomena once attributed to supernatural forces. The potential connection between contaminated food and witch panics illuminates broader patterns about how societies distribute risk, assign blame, and exercise power during crises. These patterns extend far beyond the specific case of ergot and continue to shape responses to public health threats today. Food contamination in pre-modern societies typically affected communities unevenly along lines of social privilege. The highest quality, least contaminated grain went to wealthy households and institutions, while poorer families received lower quality food with higher risk of ergot contamination. This may help explain why accusations in witch trials often began among the lower classes but sometimes moved upward socially. The initial physical symptoms would appear first in communities consuming the most contaminated food. Gender dimensions are particularly striking in both ergot poisoning and witch accusations. Women and girls appear more susceptible to the convulsive form of ergotism, possibly due to interactions between ergot alkaloids and female hormones. This biological vulnerability aligned tragically with cultural vulnerability. Women were already considered more susceptible to demonic influence according to prevailing theology. When primarily women and girls showed symptoms, this reinforced rather than challenged existing gender prejudices. The control of food has always been a form of social power. During periods of scarcity, those who controlled grain supplies, typically male authorities in religious institutions, governments, or wealthy households, exercised enormous influence over communities. The ergot theory suggests that these same power structures might have unintentionally distributed not just food, but also the toxic compounds that potentially triggered the crises they were then called upon to judge. Responses to unexplained illness still often follow patterns of blaming the vulnerable rather than examining structural causes. Modern public health crises frequently generate scapegoating of marginalized groups before scientific understanding emerges. From the initial blaming of gay men for AIDS in the 1980s to Asian communities facing discrimination during COVID-19, the impulse to assign moral blame for disease outbreaks remains powerful. The management of public fear during health crises continues to involve complex intersections of medical knowledge, political authority, and cultural belief systems. Whether in 17th century Salem or during modern pandemics, authorities face the challenge of acknowledging uncertainties while preventing panic, often with imperfect information and while balancing competing interests. Perhaps the most important parallel is how invisible threats trigger visible social responses. Ergot poisoning, like many biological hazards, was undetectable to those experiencing its effects. This invisibility created space for cultural interpretations that often reinforced existing power structures and prejudices rather than challenging them. Understanding these patterns doesn't diminish the tragedy of witch trials, but helps us recognize similar dynamics in our own responses to health crises and invisible threats, from environmental toxins to emerging diseases, and potentially develop more just and effective approaches to addressing them. At its heart, the ergot theory of witch panics raises profound questions about how humans make sense of suffering and construct explanations for disturbing experiences. These psychological processes transcend their historical context and continue to shape how we interpret unexpected phenomena today. Humans have a fundamental need for causal explanations, especially for frightening or painful experiences. When facing mysterious symptoms, whether convulsions in colonial Massachusetts or unexplained illnesses today, we instinctively seek narratives that make sense of our suffering. The specific explanations we reach for are constrained by our cultural and intellectual context. Demonic influence in the 17th century, perhaps environmental toxins or conspiracy theories today. Attribution theory in psychology helps explain why supernatural causes were readily accepted. When people experience events that are high impact, unexpected, and frightening, they typically seek explanations with similar emotional weight. Mundane explanations like food contamination might have felt insufficient to account for the terrifying experiences of convulsions and hallucinations. Supernatural causes match the emotional intensity of the experience. The role of authority figures in shaping explanations remains powerful across historical contexts. In Salem, respected ministers and magistrates validated the witchcraft interpretation, giving it institutional legitimacy. Today, trusted experts, whether scientific authorities or alternative sources that align with one's worldview, play similar roles in determining which explanations gain social acceptance during health crises or unexplained phenomena. Confirmation bias operates powerfully in these contexts. Once communities accepted witchcraft as an explanation, they interpreted all subsequent events through this framework. Evidence that seemed to confirm witchcraft received attention, while contradictory evidence was minimized or reinterpreted. This same psychological process continues to shape how communities and individuals interpret ambiguous evidence during modern crises. The human tendency toward narrative thinking is particularly evident in responses to mysterious illnesses. Rather than simply cataloguing symptoms, we create stories that give meaning to suffering, identifying heroes, villains, conflicts and resolutions. In witch trials, these narratives featured innocent victims, evil perpetrators, and the promise of resolution through identifying and removing the threat. Similar narrative structures still shape responses to everything from chronic illnesses to public health emergencies. Perhaps most poignantly, the psychological need for control drives many of these processes. Believing that suffering has an identifiable cause, even a frightening one like witchcraft, offers the promise of control through appropriate action. This can feel psychologically preferable to acknowledging that terrible things sometimes happen randomly or through complex impersonal causes beyond our influence. Understanding these psychological patterns doesn't make us immune to them, but awareness of these tendencies might help us approach unexplained phenomena with greater humility, recognizing that our instinctive explanations are shaped by psychological needs and cultural contexts that may or may not align with reality. As we conclude our journey through this strange intersection of fungus, fear, and fatal persecution, perhaps the most valuable insight isn't about ergot itself, but about the limits of human knowledge and our often fraught relationship with uncertainty. The residents of Salem in 1692 were not stupid or especially cruel by the standards of their time. They were human beings confronting terrifying, inexplicable phenomena with the knowledge frameworks available to them. Their certainty that witchcraft explained the convulsions and strange behaviour in their community led directly to the executions of 20 innocent people. Whether ergot poisoning triggered these events or not, the tragedy stemmed from excessive certainty in the face of limited understanding. Today, we often imagine ourselves immune to such mistakes. We have science, rationality, sophisticated technology, yet our relationship with uncertainty remains complicated. From pandemic responses to environmental hazards to technologies we don't fully understand, we still face scenarios where complete knowledge eludes us, but decisions must nonetheless be made. The witch trial ergot connection reminds us of the potential costs of premature certainty. Salem's magistrates believed they understood what was happening. They were as confident in their witchcraft diagnosis as we might be in our modern explanations of contemporary phenomena. Their confidence proved tragic, and the actual biological factors potentially involved remained hidden to them, despite being literally baked into their daily bread. This historical perspective invites humility when confronting the inexplicable in our own time. When faced with mysterious illnesses, unexplained phenomena, or complex social crises, perhaps the wisest first response is not immediate certainty but thoughtful, open-minded investigation that considers multiple possible explanations, including some that might not fit neatly into our existing worldview. The ergot theory also highlights the value of interdisciplinary approaches to complex problems. Understanding potential connections between fungal contamination and historical witch panics required insights from history, psychology, mycology, chemistry, climate science, and medicine. Many contemporary challenges similarly defy single-discipline explanations and solutions. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of this dark history is what it reveals about human progress. While we still face uncertainty and sometimes respond to it poorly, we have developed knowledge systems and institutional protections that make tragedies like the Salem witch trials far less likely. We haven't eliminated the fungus, ergot still grows on rye, but we've changed how we understand and respond to its effects. As we navigate our own era's uncertainties, from emerging diseases to climate change to technological disruptions, this historical perspective offers both caution and hope. Caution against premature certainty in the face of the unknown, and hope that continued knowledge-seeking can transform even our most profound misunderstandings into opportunities for greater wisdom and compassion. Thanks for joining me for this journey through the strange world of ergot and its potential role in witch hunts. But before we wrap up completely, I want to introduce you to another fascinating historical figure who understood power, poison, and the fine art of manipulation better than perhaps anyone in Renaissance Europe. Let's spend some time with one of history's most influential and misunderstood women, Catherine de' Medici, the Italian banker's daughter who became the most formidable queen mother France has ever known. In the spring of 1519, in the opulent surroundings of Florence's Medici Palace, a baby girl was born into one of Renaissance Italy's most powerful banking families. No one could have predicted that this child, Catherine de' Medici, would become one of the most influential women in European history. Her journey from Italian merchant princess to French queen mother would reshape the politics, culture, and religious landscape of an entire continent. Catherine's early life was marked by tragedy and uncertainty. Within weeks of her birth, her mother died from postpartum complications. Her father, Lorenzo II de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, followed just days later, likely from tuberculosis. Orphaned before she could even recognise her parents' faces, Catherine's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of political chaos as the Medici family temporarily lost control of Florence. Raised first by relatives and then in convents, young Catherine received an unusually comprehensive education for a Renaissance girl. She studied mathematics, astronomy, and multiple languages, but also learned the practical skills of governance and political manoeuvring that would later serve her so well. While many historical accounts describe her as physically plain, short and stocky with protruding eyes, contemporaries noted her quick intelligence and remarkable memory. Catherine's destiny changed dramatically at age 14, when her distant cousin Pope Clement VII arranged her marriage to Henri, the second son of King Francis I of France. This wasn't a love match, but a calculated political alliance, the merchant banker Medicis buying their way into royal legitimacy, while the French crown gained access to Medici wealth and Italian influence. When Catherine arrived in Marseilles for her wedding in 1533, the French court was unimpressed by this Italian banking heiress. Little did they know that this seemingly unremarkable teenager would eventually control their nation's fate. As she adjusted to French court life, Catherine began developing the patient, observant approach to power that would become her hallmark, watching, learning, and waiting for her moment while cultivating relationships with everyone from servants to nobility. These early years of relative powerlessness shaped the political survival skills that would ultimately make her one of Europe's most formidable leaders. For the first decade of her marriage, Catherine endured a series of humiliations that would have broken a lesser woman. Her husband Henri showed her little affection, instead devoting himself to his elegant mistress Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years his senior. In the cruel hierarchy of the French court, Catherine was forced to accept her subordinate position to her husband's lover, who exercised enormous influence over both Henri and court politics. More devastating was Catherine's apparent inability to produce an heir. For 10 years, the young queen remained childless, putting her position in grave jeopardy. King Francis I allegedly considered having the marriage annulled, as a barren wife was useless to the Valois dynasty. Court gossips cruelly referred to her as the barren Florentine merchant's daughter. The pressure was immense. Catherine tried everything from physicians' concoctions to folk remedies. She reportedly even drilled a hole in the floor of her chamber to spy on Diane and Henri's lovemaking, hoping to discover the secret to fertility. Some historians suggest Henri may have had a physical abnormality that made conception difficult until it was surgically corrected. Against these personal indignities, Catherine developed her lifelong strategy of patience and adaptability. Rather than confronting Diane directly, she accepted her position and cultivated her own areas of influence. She became known for her organizational skills, intelligence, and ability to charm when necessary. She turned to cultural patronage, supporting artists and organizing elaborate court entertainments that displayed her Italian Renaissance sensibilities. The turning point came in 1544 when, after a decade of disappointment, Catherine finally gave birth to a son, the future Francis II. This miracle was followed by a succession of 9 more children over the next 12 years, transforming her position at court. 7 survived infancy, a remarkable achievement in an era of high child mortality. Though she had secured her place as royal mother, Catherine still exercised little direct power. Henri continued to favour Diane, even allowing his mistress to raise the royal children. Catherine endured this arrangement stoically, focusing on her children's futures while carefully building alliances throughout the court. She was learning the art of power through observation. lessons that would serve her well when fate suddenly transformed her role in French history. In the summer of 1559, during a jousting tournament celebrating the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to Philip II of Spain, King Henri VII took a lance splinter through his visor and into his eye. After 10 days of agony, he died of the wound, transforming Catherine's world overnight. Her eldest son, the sickly 15-year-old Francis II, became king, and Catherine found herself suddenly elevated from the shadows to the centre of French power. Her first political act revealed the calculation and psychological insight that would define her rule. While courtiers expected her to banish her longtime rival Diane de Poitiers, Catherine instead offered the royal mistress a dignified exit and fair treatment in exchange for royal properties and jewels. This measured response displayed not mercy, but pragmatism. Catherine understood that gratuitous cruelty would create enemies, while magnanimity and victory could convert former adversaries. The real power behind young Francis's throne initially rested with the powerful Guise family, uncles of his young wife Mary, Queen of Scots. Catherine manoeuvred carefully during this period, building her position while allowing the Guises to take public blame for increasingly unpopular policies. She was playing the long game, and events soon favoured her approach. When Francis died of an ear infection in December of 1560 after barely 18 months on the throne, Catherine's second son Charles became king at just 10 years old. The Guises' direct connection to the throne vanished with Mary Stuart's widowhood, creating a power vacuum that Catherine swiftly filled. She secured appointment as regent, officially making her the most powerful person in France. From that moment, Catherine emerged as a formidable political operator. Drawing on decades of careful observation and relationship building, she assembled a loyal network of informants and allies throughout the kingdom. She positioned herself as a moderate force in an increasingly divided nation, working to balance the competing interests of Catholic and Protestant factions while strengthening royal authority. This unexpected ascent required Catherine to transform from patient observer to decisive actor. The Italian merchant's daughter, who many had dismissed, became the de facto ruler of France, wielding power with a combination of political shrewdness, psychological manipulation, and pragmatic flexibility that both impressed and disturbed her contemporaries. The stage was set for 3 decades of Catherine's dominance in French politics. When Catherine assumed power as regent, France was teetering on the brink of religious civil war. The Protestant Reformation had spread rapidly through the kingdom, with Calvinist Huguenots gaining significant influence among the nobility and urban populations. Traditional Catholic forces, led by powerful families like the Guises, viewed Protestantism as heresy that threatened the very foundations of society and monarchy. Catherine, though personally Catholic, approached this religious divide with pragmatism rather than zealotry. While most European rulers of the era took hardline positions in the religious conflicts, Catherine initially sought a middle path, attempting to promote limited tolerance and political stability over theological purity. This moderate stance reflected both her Medici commercial background, where religious differences often took a backseat to financial partnerships, and her primary concern with preserving royal authority and her sons' thrones. In 1561, she organised the Colloquy of Poissy, bringing together Catholic and Protestant theologians in an unprecedented attempt at religious reconciliation. When this failed, she worked with her Chancellor Michel de l'Hôpital to issue the Edict of January in 1562, granting Huguenots limited rights to worship publicly, a remarkably progressive policy for the time. These conciliatory efforts earned Catherine hatred from Catholic hardliners who viewed religious compromise as unthinkable. The Duke of Guise's massacre of Protestant worshippers at Vassy in March 1562 shattered Catherine's hopes for moderation and plunged France into the first of 8 brutal religious civil wars that would rack the country for decades. Throughout these conflicts, Catherine's approach remained consistently pragmatic rather than ideological. She shifted alliances and policies as needed, sometimes supporting Catholic forces, other times negotiating with Huguenot leaders like Admiral Coligny. Her primary aim was always to maintain royal authority and prevent any single faction from becoming too powerful. This flexible approach led to accusations of duplicity from both sides, with Catholics questioning her religious commitment and Protestants distrusting her Catholic inclinations. In reality, Catherine's highest loyalty was to the crown and her son's power, with religious considerations secondary. In an era when most Europeans viewed religious compromise as heresy, Catherine's pragmatic approach was both innovative and widely misunderstood, positioning her as a surprisingly modern figure caught in an age of religious absolutism. No event in Catherine de' Medici's long political career has defined her historical reputation more dramatically than the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 24, 1572. What began as a targeted assassination spiraled into one of the most horrific episodes of religious violence in European history, with thousands of Huguenots slaughtered throughout Paris and later across France. The massacre occurred during seemingly hopeful circumstances, the marriage of Catherine's Catholic daughter Marguerite to the Protestant Henry of Navarre, a union intended to heal religious divisions. Leading Huguenots had gathered in predominantly Catholic Paris for the wedding celebrations, creating an unprecedented concentration of Protestant leadership in the capital. The crisis began when an assassination attempt against influential Huguenot leader Admiral Coligny failed, only wounding him. Fearing Huguenot retaliation, and the Admiral's growing influence over her son, King Charles IX, Catherine allegedly participated in a fateful late-night council that ordered the elimination of key Protestant leaders. What happened next exceeded all expectations. The targeted killings of Protestant nobles triggered a massive popular uprising, with Catholic Parisians turning on their Huguenot neighbours in an orgy of violence that lasted for days. The bloodshed spread to other cities, with death tolls estimated between 5,000 and 30,000. Catherine's exact role remains debated by historians. Did she intend only a limited number of strategic assassinations that spiraled beyond control? Or did she deliberately unleash widespread violence? Contemporary accounts differ wildly, with Protestant sources portraying her as a calculating mastermind who planned the massacre years in advance, while others suggest she responded desperately to a volatile situation that threatened her son's throne. What's clear is that Catherine neither effectively prevented the massacre, nor immediately stopped it once it began. After the violence, she helped craft a royal narrative portraying the killings as necessary to prevent a Huguenot coup, suggesting at minimum her willingness to embrace the massacre's political utility after the fact. St. Bartholomew's Day transformed Catherine's image across Europe. In Catholic regions, she was briefly celebrated as a defender of the faith, while in Protestant areas, she became the Italian woman, a sinister foreign influence embodying the worst stereotypes of Machiavellian Italian politics. This latter characterization has largely defined her historical reputation, overshadowing her more complex political legacy and the challenging circumstances she navigated. In the decades following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a dark mythology crystallized around Catherine de' Medici, a black legend that portrayed her as a poisoner, practitioner of dark arts, and ruthlessly immoral schemer. This sinister reputation, heavily influenced by Protestant propaganda and cultural prejudices, has proven remarkably durable, shaping her portrayal in everything from historical accounts to modern films and novels. Central to this mythologizing was Catherine's Italian heritage. Anti-Italian sentiment ran high in 16th century France, with Italians stereotyped as masters of poison, political duplicity, and occult practices. As an Italian woman exercising unprecedented political power, Catherine became the perfect vessel for these cultural anxieties. Rumours circulated that she carried poisoned gloves in secret compartments in her escritoire filled with toxic powders, claims for which no credible evidence exists. Her interest in astronomy and support of Nostradamus fed accusations of dark magical practices. Though her consultation with astrologers was entirely conventional for Renaissance royalty, in Catherine's case, it was reframed as evidence of demonic influence. Even her cultural innovations became suspect. Her introduction of Italian perfumes, cuisine, and ballet to the French court were portrayed by critics as further evidence of foreign corruption. The historical record provides little support for the more lurid aspects of Catherine's black legend. No convincing evidence suggests she poisoned political opponents, a remarkably inefficient method of elimination in an era when royal authority could more easily dispatch enemies through legal means. Her documented actions reveal a pragmatic politician operating according to the ruthless standards of her era, not an exceptionally bloodthirsty or immoral figure by contemporary standards. What's most striking about Catherine's dark reputation is its gendered nature. Male rulers of the period, including her contemporary Philip II of Spain, who oversaw the brutal suppression of Protestants in the Netherlands, engaged in similar or worse political violence without acquiring comparable reputations for personal evil. Catherine's crime, in many ways, was exercising traditionally masculine power as a woman, while refusing to align herself absolutely with either religious faction. The persistence of this black legend reveals more about historical misogyny and anti-Italian prejudice than about Catherine herself. It represents one of history's most successful character assassination campaigns, transforming a complex, pragmatic female ruler into a one-dimensional villain who continues to haunt the popular imagination. While Catherine's political reputation remains controversial, her role as one of Renaissance Europe's greatest artistic and cultural patrons is undisputed. Throughout her life, she channeled significant resources into transforming French court culture, leaving a legacy that shaped European aesthetics for generations. Architecture was among her greatest passions. Catherine commissioned major renovations to the Louvre, Fontainebleau, and the Tuileries, while also building her magnificent new Hôtel de la Reine. These projects blended French and Italian Renaissance styles, introducing new architectural elements to France. Her buildings featured innovative details like the first flushing toilets in France and advanced kitchens that reflected her interest in both luxury and practical improvement. Perhaps her most significant cultural innovation was introducing ballet to the French court. The Ballet Comique de la Reine of 1581, sponsored by Catherine, is widely considered the first true ballet, combining music, dance, verse, and spectacular mechanical effects into a unified artistic production. These elaborate court entertainments, known as magnificences, weren't merely frivolous diversions but sophisticated political tools that displayed royal power and cultural refinement to both domestic and foreign audiences. Catherine assembled one of Europe's finest art collections, commissioning works from leading artists and importing Italian masterpieces. She supported pioneering female artists like Sofonisba Anguissola at a time when women rarely received such patronage. Her enthusiasm for portraiture was particularly notable. She commissioned hundreds of portraits, understanding their political value for dynastic and diplomatic purposes. As a bibliophile, Catherine built an exceptional library of rare manuscripts and texts, including significant scientific and medical works. She patronized scholars, poets, and musicians, making the French court a center of intellectual and artistic activity. Even her interest in astrology reflected Renaissance humanism's blend of scientific inquiry and traditional knowledge systems. Catherine's cultural patronage served multiple purposes. It certainly reflected her personal tastes and Renaissance education, but also functioned as sophisticated propaganda, associating the French monarchy with magnificence and innovation. During periods of civil unrest, her spectacular court entertainments created an impression of normalcy and royal control. This cultural legacy represents Catherine's most unambiguously positive contribution to French history. Long after the religious wars ended and her political machinations were forgotten, the artistic traditions she established continued to flourish, helping establish France as Europe's cultural epicenter in subsequent centuries. Catherine's most effective political tool wasn't poison or dark magic, but something far more conventional in Renaissance power politics: strategic marriages. Through a sophisticated network of marital alliances for her numerous children, she attempted to extend Valois influence throughout Europe while simultaneously managing domestic religious tensions. Her most ambitious project was placing her children on multiple European thrones. She succeeded remarkably well. Her son Henry III briefly held the Polish crown before returning to rule France, while her daughters Elizabeth and Claude married into the powerful Spanish Habsburg dynasty and the House of Lorraine respectively. Her daughter Margaret's marriage to Henry of Navarre was intended to heal religious divisions, though it failed spectacularly in that aim. Catherine approached these marriage negotiations with meticulous attention to detail and remarkable diplomatic skill. She personally arranged the elaborate celebrations, understood the complex contractual elements, and maintained correspondence with her married children to leverage these connections. Few European rulers managed dynastic politics more effectively. Beyond these high-profile royal marriages, Catherine orchestrated unions among the French nobility with similar strategic precision. She maintained a legendary flying squadron of beautiful ladies-in-waiting who served as both informants and potential marriage candidates for politically important noblemen. While later accounts exaggerated the sexual nature of this arrangement, Catherine unquestionably used the marriage market as a means of creating loyalty networks and gathering intelligence. Her matchmaking wasn't merely cynical political calculation. Catherine took genuine interest in her children's marriages, corresponding frequently with her daughters about everything from managing difficult spouses to maintaining health during pregnancy. She viewed successful marriages as essential to both family prestige and personal happiness, reflecting the Renaissance view of matrimony as a fundamental social institution. What made Catherine's marriage diplomacy exceptional was its scale and ambition. At a time when most royal women might arrange marriages for daughters, and perhaps granddaughters, Catherine orchestrated matrimonial alliances across multiple generations and countries, creating a web of relationships that positioned the Valois family at the centre of European politics. This approach to power through marriage alliances reveals Catherine's pragmatic genius. Rather than relying solely on military might or religious authority, areas where women's direct involvement was limited, she expertly wielded the traditionally feminine power of marriage arrangement to achieve political objectives that male rulers often pursued through warfare. By the 1580s, Catherine's long reign as the dominant force in French politics was drawing to a close. Now in her 60s, elderly by Renaissance standards, she found her health declining along with her political influence. The death of her favourite son, François, Duke of Anjou, in 1584 marked the beginning of her final difficult phase. With François gone, the heir presumptive to the French throne became the Protestant Henry of Navarre, Catherine's son-in-law but religious adversary. This succession crisis threatened everything Catherine had worked decades to achieve: the continuation of Valois rule and religious stability. She threw herself into increasingly desperate diplomatic efforts to resolve the succession, but found her influence over her surviving son, the erratic King Henry III, dramatically diminished. The king increasingly ignored his mother's counsel, allying himself with the Catholic League against her advice, and eventually ordering the assassination of the Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic faction. This act, which Catherine had strongly opposed, triggered yet another phase of civil war, and destroyed what remained of a royal authority. Catherine's health deteriorated rapidly during these tumultuous events. Suffering from pleurisy and likely pneumonia, she took to her bed at Blois in December 1588. Even from her deathbed, she continued writing letters and attempting to manage the political crisis, but her strength was fading. On January 5, 1589, Catherine de Medici died at age 69, reportedly whispering that her death would bring little mourning and less care. She was right about the mourning. France was too fractured by civil war for elaborate funeral ceremonies, and Catherine was hastily buried at Blois before being transferred later to the Saint-Denis Basilica. Less than 8 months after her death, her son Henry III was assassinated, ending the Valois dynasty she had worked so tirelessly to preserve. The final tragedy of Catherine's life was witnessing the collapse of her life's work. After decades of political manoeuvring to maintain Valois power and prevent religious extremism from tearing France apart, she died with the kingdom in chaos and her dynasty on the brink of extinction. Yet ironically, the eventual solution to France's crisis would incorporate elements of the religious compromise she had long advocated. When Henry of Navarre converted to Catholicism, while granting Protestants limited rights, suggesting that Catherine's pragmatic approach had been ahead of its time, in the centuries following her death, Catherine de Medici's reputation remained largely defined by the black legend created by her enemies, the image of a sinister Italian poison wielder practicing dark arts and orchestrating massacres. This caricature dominated historical accounts, novels, plays, and eventually films, reducing one of history's most complex female rulers to a one-dimensional villain. Only in the latter half of the 20th century did historians begin seriously reassessing Catherine's legacy, approaching her with the same analytical framework applied to male rulers, rather than through the lens of gendered stereotypes. This revisionist perspective reveals a far more nuanced figure whose actions become comprehensible, if not always admirable, when viewed in the brutal context of 16th century power politics. Modern scholarship emphasises several aspects of Catherine's reign that deserve recognition. Her political flexibility and search for middle ground during the wars of religion represented a pragmatic approach that, while unsuccessful in her lifetime, presaged later solutions to Europe's religious conflicts. Her administrative skills and attention to governance details helped maintain functional royal authority during periods of extreme instability. Catherine's cultural patronage had lasting significance beyond her political achievements. The artistic traditions she established helped position France as Europe's cultural leader in subsequent centuries. Her architectural projects literally reshaped Paris, while her promotion of ballet created an art form that flourishes to this day. As one of history's most powerful female rulers, Catherine navigated unique challenges. Unable to lead armies or claim divine right as male monarchs did, she developed alternative sources of authority through intelligence networks, cultural patronage, and family connections. Her methods, often criticised as manipulative or underhanded, largely reflected the limited avenues of power available to women in her era. Perhaps most significantly, Catherine's life exemplifies the Renaissance ideal of virtu, not moral virtue in the modern sense, but the ability to adapt to changing fortunes and exercise practical wisdom in pursuit of goals. From her orphaned childhood to her humiliating early marriage to her unexpected rise to power, Catherine repeatedly demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. The ultimate reassessment of Catherine de' Medici isn't about rehabilitating her as a misunderstood heroine or doubling down on her villainous reputation. Rather, it's about recognising her as a fully human figure of extraordinary complexity, a woman who wielded unprecedented power during one of European history's most violent periods, making difficult and sometimes terrible decisions in pursuit of stability, survival, and dynastic continuity. Neither monster nor martyr, Catherine de' Medici stands as one of history's most fascinating studies in the possibilities and limitations of female political power in a world designed for male rule. Thanks for joining me for these journeys through three fascinating historical topics: the strange persecution of left-handed people, the bizarre story of ergot poisoning and witch hunts, and the complex life of Catherine de' Medici. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the stranger corners of history, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what mysterious historical topics you'd like me to explore next time. Until then, remember that history is rarely as simple as it first appears, and today's common sense might look a lot like yesterday's superstition when viewed from the future. See you in the next one.